John Paul Herbert, or Johnny, raced in Formula One from 1989 through to the turn of the millennium, and his professional career included stints in sports cars, touring cars, and even stock cars right up until the early 2010s. He is a versatile driver who seems to want to turn his hand to everything at least once, and he always races well, even if his qualifying performances leave a lot to be desired. Since I just covered his final Grand Prix win on this channel, I think it's time I delved into his career as a whole and picked out the standout moments that made this man an F1 legend. Herbert had a long career in karting, which started when he was just 10 years old, although I could find surprisingly little about it, except that he was British Junior Karting Champion in either 1977 or 1978, and outright British Karting Champion in 1982. Impressive results, to be sure, but the first actual car race I can find a record of him competing in was the Formula Ford Festival in 1985, which he won. Yes, this was a grid containing several future professional racers like Mark Blundell, Eric van der Poel, Frank Bieler, Perry McCarthy, Tim Harvey, Roland Ratzenberger, and even Damon Hill, and yet complete newcomer Johnny Herbert was the one who came out on top. He wasn't even driving a Van Diemen, Reynard or Lola like most of the other top guys were. Instead, he had a little car I'd never even heard of before called a Quest Ivy, a car so obscure it doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. After a few races in 1986 with Micro Racing and Intersport Racing, Johnny joined forces with Eddie Jordan, who at the time ran cars in both F3 and F3000, but not yet in Formula One. Together they won the 1987 British Formula 3 Championship and the Cellnet Super Prix, once again beating several future professionals such as Damon Hill. Johnny was clearly extremely naturally talented, and with Nigel Mansell losing to Nelson Piquet in the F1 world, the British public were hungry for a British success story. Unfortunately, despite the success he would later go on to achieve, Johnny is perhaps best remembered for what might have been if not for a horrific accident which happened in an F3000 race at Brands Hatch in 1988. Johnny had a poor start which he attributed to lining up at an angle on the grid, and while trying to minimise the damage from this, he tangled with Gregor Wojtek and slammed feet first into a bridge support which tore off the front of his car. He then spun back across the track, walloping the wall on the other side with his now unprotected legs, which shattered them and nearly took them clean off. Despite not losing consciousness, Johnny was severely injured and would spend several months in hospital recovering, but incredibly he decided not to quit racing and underwent an extreme amount of physical therapy and exercise to get his legs to work like he needed them to. Johnny lost a lot of feeling in his legs after that crash, and there's no doubt that he was never quite as good afterwards. Some people say that he would have been a world champion someday if this accident hadn't happened, but unfortunately we'll never know for sure, so we can only speculate. Johnny himself would probably like you to believe that he would have been champion, of course, but he said in a 2018 interview that he's come to terms with the fact that his accident happened because, in his own words, it was a bloody good crash. Throughout the course of his recovery, several F1 teams continued to believe in Johnny, who had always been on course for a seat in 1989 with either Benetton or Lotus, and less than 7 months after his accident he was driving for Benetton at pre-season testing in Brazil. This was a massive gamble for everyone involved, as Johnny was still walking with a stick at this time, and another accident would probably have ended his career for good, but the higher-ups at Benetton clearly believed in a trial by fire because they tasked him with completing a full race distance test stint. While his Benetton mechanics took bets amongst themselves about how far he'd actually get, Johnny went and turned laps, continuing on until eventually the car ran out of fuel. He had done it, and he would race in 1989, despite the doctors having told him that he would never drive a racing car again. Herbert made his F1 debut at the 1989 Brazilian Grand Prix, and he actually achieved one of his best ever qualifying performances straight away by outqualifying his teammate Nannini and putting his car 10th on the grid. The race lasted 99 minutes in total, and Johnny was in excruciating pain the entire time due to a bump in the middle of turn 4 causing his damaged foot to bump against his steering column every single lap. Most people would have pitted after just a few laps of this, realising that it wasn't worth it, but Johnny was determined to finish his first Grand Prix. And he did. in 4th place. In fact, he was just 1 second off the podium at the end of the race, and less than 3 seconds off of Alain Prost in 2nd place. Remember, the Benetton in 1989 was far from the best car out there. It ended up just 4th in the championship that year. For these reasons, I personally feel that this drive should go down in history as the greatest F1 debut of all time. After a few more sporadic starts in F1 for Benetton, Tyrrell and then Lotus, Herbert turned his hand to sports car racing in both Japan and Le Mans. He retired from the Le Mans 24 Hours in 1990, driving for Mazda Speed, but he came back in 1991 with the angelic-sounding 787B, and this time came home 2 laps clear of the less reliable competition, making him a Le Mans 24-hour winner along with his teammates Volker Wiedler and Bertrand Gachot. Johnny was so exhausted by the end of the race that he had to be carried away from his car, as you can see. During a 500-mile race at Fuji in 1991, Takao Wada had a horrendous accident when his rear left tyre burst, causing the car to spin, flip several times, and burst into flames. In this footage, you can see Johnny Herbert stopping his car in the background and running over to Takao to help him escape from the burning wreckage, a move that won Herbert an award for sportsmanship at that year's Autosport Awards. Wada survived this accident with minor injuries, and Herbert went on to finish the race. Benetton was a team on the rise in the mid-1990s, with Michael Schumacher acting as their first ever title challenger. Unfortunately, their second seat seemed harder to fill, as JJ Leiter and Jos Verstappen both failed to achieve the results that Benetton needed from them, much like a Red Bull situation circa 2019 or 2020. As a result of this, Leiter and Verstappen were dropped, and back came Johnny Herbert for the last 2 races of 94 and then the whole of 95. At first it seemed like much of the same, as Johnny failed to match Schumacher's performances and really struggled in qualifying, but he did pick up a slightly lucky first podium at the Spanish Grand Prix. However, it was at Silverstone where he had his first major F1 breakthrough, as Schumacher and Hill collided, allowing Herbert to sweep through and win in front of his home crowd. Admittedly, this win was also slightly lucky, but being the best of the rest behind the championship contenders was nothing to be sniffed at, so even though it wasn't his best ever performance, it was still a fairy tale story and still deserves a place on this list. Later that same year at the Italian Grand Prix, the unthinkable happened. Schumacher and Hill collided yet again. It looked at that point like Ferrari would head for a historic Monza 1-2, but when they both retired in gutting circumstances, it was Johnny Herbert who came through to win on a day when Benetton had the 3rd fastest car at best. Once again, it was quite a lucky win, but in all honesty, I think Johnny drove like a champion on that day, not making any mistakes and just doing all that he needed to. And sometimes that's all a team can ask for from their driver. If there's one type of circuit that Johnny always struggled with, they were street circuits. Tracks like Monaco require high levels of braking precision that he just didn't have due to the reduced feeling in his feet, so he tended to take these races cautiously and just ride them out. Well, it turns out that on a wet day in 1996 that's exactly what he needed to do, because when all but 2 other drivers retired from the race due to a slew of accidents, he suddenly found himself running in 3rd place. This was technically last place, of course, but honestly, just finishing on a day like that was a huge achievement, especially for a man who was still hiding just how much he was struggling with his injuries. This was Herbert's first podium for Sauber, who he re-signed for 1997. Talking of 97, the Hungarian Grand Prix that year is mostly well known for Damon Hill's shock podium for Arrows, but this underdog success often overshadows another one, which was that of Johnny Herbert coming home 3rd for Sauber. Herbert beat both the Schumachers on that day, and he finished 4th next time out in Belgium as well. Herbert then moved to Stewart Grand Prix for 1999, although he probably didn't expect much from the move, as the 98 car had been unreliable and tricky to master. However, the 99 car showed pace early on, and at the European Grand Prix that year, a race that recently took the record for the best rated Grand Prix ever covered on my random F1 race reviews series, Johnny Herbert took the lead and won from 14th on the grid as the championship leaders fell by the wayside. This was Johnny's largest win, his most unexpected win, and his final win in Formula 1, so it makes sense that this is what he should be remembered for. It seemed to rejuvenate him too, as he says himself that the very next Grand Prix in Malaysia was the best he's ever felt behind the wheel of a Formula 1 car, and he went on to finish 4th in that one too. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and Herbert's F1 career ended rather dismally after a pointless season with Jaguar in 2000. After F1, he went on to achieve success in sports car racing, winning races at Sebring, Road Atlanta, Road America, Miami and Laguna Seca, as well as winning the Le Mans Legend race in 2005. The final success of Herbert's racing career was in the Speed Car Series, a short-lived Asian stock car championship involving several of Johnny's old F1 opponents such as John Alesi, Heinz-Harald Frentzen and even Jacques Villeneuve. In 2008, Herbert beat David Terrier to the championship at the last round, despite tying with him on points. It was Herbert's last championship victory. Since finishing his racing career, Herbert has turned to punditry, lending his voice and opinions to Sky Sports F1. As a regular Channel 4 viewer myself, I don't see much of Herbert nowadays, but whenever I do, I personally think he comes across as knowledgeable and witty, even if he says himself that he finds it harder and more stressful than racing. At 58 years old, Herbert's career in motorsports is far from over, and even if he never starts another race, he will surely still be a valuable part of the F1 community for years to come. That's the end of this video now, so drive safely guys, and thank you for watching.